Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's digital discussion on how data can be used to advance women and girls' rights, women and girls' education post-pandemic. I'm Emma Smith, a reporter with Devex, and joining you today from Barcelona. Today's event is part of a series in partnership with Facebook, where we've been digging into how data can be used to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. So over the last weeks, the conversations have covered maternal and reproductive health services, support for women, migrants and refugees, and frontline health workers. If you've missed any of these events, not to worry, you can still catch up on them and you can still join the conversation online using the hashtags GenderData and Devex event. So today we're going to be looking at how COVID-19 has impacted women and girls' education. Back in March, UNESCO estimated that over 1 billion children and young people were out of school or university due to government-mandated closures aimed at slowing the spread of the coronavirus. This has affected over 110 million girls in low and middle-income countries, where there may already have been significant barriers for them in accessing and completing their education. Experts across the sector are concerned that decades' worth of gains in gender equality and girls' education are under threat, as many girls won't return to schools when they reopen. And that's because during the last months, girls are more likely to have been burdened with additional responsibilities around the home and are more likely to have been vulnerable to physical or sexual abuse. It's also thought that we're going to see a rise in the number of early marriages among vulnerable families and an increase in teen pregnancies. We've seen similar patterns emerge from other crisis situations where education has been disrupted and livelihoods have been impacted. During the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, for example, an estimated 5 million children were affected by school closures in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. In many cases, girls ended up dropping out of school completely due to an increase in domestic responsibilities and a shift towards income generation. This had also limited their ability to continue their learning from home. And that's another concern that has emerged in the last months, as access to technology, which is in some cases still controlled by male members of the household, has been another barrier for girls in trying to continue their education during lockdowns. So today we're going to be diving into these issues and looking at what is being done now to ensure women and girls don't miss out on an education and the role that data can play as we build back from this pandemic. Before I introduce today's panelists, just a few quick notes on today's event. The event will last about an hour and will include a moderated discussion followed by a short presentation demonstrating how data can be used to advance education goals. There will also be time set aside for some Q&A, so you can submit your questions to any of the panelists at any point during today's event using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues during today's event, you can use the same chat box to let a member of our team know and they will assist you. Finally, today's event is being recorded and we'll be sending you a copy of the recording and a copy of all the slides afterwards, so no worries if you miss anything. So hopefully joining us now on the screen is our panel of experts for today, who all work with organisations focused on girls' rights and education. Yep, looks like they're joining us now. So first we have Safeena Husain, founder and executive director of Educate Girls based in India. Next, we have Hamzat Lawal, also known as Hamzy, who is founder and chief executive of Connected Development and a Malala education champion. We also have Laban Onisimus, who is an education lead with Plan International Nigeria. And finally, we have Sunita Grote, who is the manager for UNICEF's Innovation Venture Fund and co-leads on their Giga initiative, which we're going to be hearing a bit more about later in today's event. Huge thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. It's great to have you with us. Safeena, if I can kick things off with you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about what you see or are hearing happen in India as a result of the pandemic and the school closures, and how this might impact whether or not girls return to schools when they reopen.
Thank you, Emma. And yes, I would love to start with what we're seeing on the ground. With that, I just wanted to kind of set a little bit of a context to Educate Girls works in some of the most rural, remote and tribal areas. So everything that my experience is very much of working with some of the most vulnerable girls. So that's the context that I'm speaking from. Currently, we work across about 17,500 villages, about 2 million children daily. So that's the kind of scale, but really very, very focused from rural India. What we're seeing is that There are about 17 times increases in domestic abuse cases. We're seeing doubling of calls to the women's helplines. Childline, which is our SOS emergency helpline for children, received 92,000 SOS calls in the first 11 days of the lockdown. And really, a lot of this is happening because for women and girls, there are two P's that impact us: poverty and patriarchy. And COVID is making both of those exponentially worse. With loss of livelihoods, poverty is getting worse and worse, especially in areas where migrants have come back, the kind of areas we work in. And patriarchy, with the lockdown, women and girls are being forced back into the gender roles. We're also seeing extreme hunger because in the kind of families where we work, girls eat last and eat what is left over. So when there's less food and there's poverty, you're actually really seeing that our girls are hungrier, they're unsafe. So it's not a good situation. And overall, we have about 247 million children in India alone that are impacted, and across elementary to secondary schools. So that's what we're kind of seeing. We're hearing some horrendous stories, and also the digital divide. Adolescent girls in particular, are bearing a really critical and high burden of this pandemic. So really, whether you talk about class or religion or anything else, or caste, women and girls are generally at the bottom of this, and they will pay the highest price of this pandemic.
Great, thank you, Safeena, for kicking us off there. Hamzy, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the situation in Nigeria at the moment and how the restrictions and school closures are impacting girls and women there.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. After the index case around February and government institutionalized closure of school and lockdown, what we've seen is a spike on girls and gender-based violence being reported. And here there's a likelihood that after COVID-19, over 20 million girls would not be able to go to school between school-age girls. And before COVID-19, and just to put this into context, Nigeria has a record of the highest number of out-of-school children from around the world. The last data was over 10 million children that are out of school in Nigeria. But for us as Malala champion, what we have tried to do is leverage on offline campaign methodology using technology tool and platform like radio to disseminate education, literacy and education materials around STEM, giving these children access to learning materials during the lockdown. And particularly in Boko Haram ravaged northeastern states in Borno, where one of our champion, Abubakar, have been able to distribute over 200 radios to girls in Borno state. Before now, he has a girl club that he sort of coordinates, and with the lockdown, using radio to tutor and mentorship session with these girls just to ensure that they get educated. But we're still seeing that spike in girl-child marriage. Yeah, I need to stress that. So right now we're seeing, and when I say abuse, we're getting incident report around rape, around abuse, around molestation of girls and women, and now the increase in girl-child marriage. So what this tells you is after COVID-19, a lot of these girls would be girls that are below 18 years, sadly, would be would be carrying the burden of running a home as a woman.
Great, thank you for that, Hamzy. Laban, if I can ask you to tell us a little bit about the work that your team has been doing since the beginning of the lockdown to ensure that girls aren't missing out on their education and that this won't have such a long-term impact on that. Oh, sorry, Laban, I think you're on mute. If you can just hit them. There we go.
Let me just put a rider to what Hamza have said. In Nigeria, between January and May this year, 717 cases of rape were reported. We live in a culture of silence in Nigeria, and these cases were the ones reported. So for us in Nigeria, mostly the northern part of the country, we're dealing with a triple pandemic: poverty, insurgency, and recently the COVID-19. For us in Plan International, what we try to do is issue of continuous sensitization, basically virtually on what the pandemic is, and also the need for girls to go back to school. So as soon as schools resume. So what we are doing at the moment is a robust kind of campaign, back to school campaign. We're also trying to engage with the Mothers Association. The Mothers Association is actually a subset of the school-based management committee, where we'll go on to enlighten them on the importance of girls' education. This time around is actually being done like door to door in the communities that we're working with. Going further also, we try to adapt to the situation that we're in at the moment. So we have established learning and reading cycles of not more than 10 children, especially in the northern part of the country, and emphasizing on the need for girls to be part of those learning cycles. Because we know typically in a setting like that, girls will be going about doing other house jobs when there is a need for them to actually be in the classroom. Now, on the wider platform for the Education in Emergency Working Group, what we try to do is to engage with government officials. And recently, we have supported the development of a guideline for the reopening of schools. Now, as Plan International, our emphasis is mostly on the issue of girls. So our inputs to that document was really focused on the need for government to put in place some facilities for girls while they are back to school. We have also raised the conversation around the reopening of schools, having a series of national discourse, looking at the digital divide, looking at the issues of remote learning, looking at the issue of alternative learning also, and looking at also the issue of what needs to be in place before schools resumes. So these are the kind of strategic engagement that we have been engaging with for the past 4 months when schools are actually out of use at the moment.
Great, thank you for that, Laban. Safeena, if I can ask you to tell us a little bit about what Educate Girls have been doing in India to kind of minimize the impact of this pandemic on girls' education.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe what I'll do is I'll speak about it from the lens of data and just kind of highlight how we've been using data to kind of tackle this problem. So Educate Girls, actually, we go door to door and we find every single girl in our villages that's not in school, that's either dropped out or never enrolled. And to give you an idea of the scale, we've actually knocked on about 4.5 million households in the last few years. So we have some incredibly fantastic data. And what we've been doing over the past 2 years is using, 2 or 3 years now almost, is using a lot of predictive analytics, machine learning work to use our data layered with secondary data to be able to predict hotspots where girls are out of school. And actually what we see is that where patriarchy and poverty intersect, our data shows us that you have explosions, like hotspots of major out of school girls. So what we do is we've been predicting, so using data very efficiently to precision target those villages which have the highest number of out of school girls. And right now our predictive technology is about 89% accuracy in terms of predictions, and the algorithms just getting better year on year. So one is really precision targeting those villages which have the highest number of girls that are out of school. And then once we're there, we're actually working with community, school administration, everybody to bring the girls back into the school system. And one way is obviously tackling poverty, is strengthening their connection to social protection schemes, etc. For example, in Madhya Pradesh, students didn't have Aadhaar cards. And because of not having the documentation, the girls wouldn't be put into school. So really making sure that all of that bottlenecks can be removed. And the second is patriarchy, which is really about mindset change, convincing people that girls' education is the best investment that they can make, and bringing the girls back into school. During the pandemic, because of this data-driven approach, we've actually zoned in and delivered food supplies to about 450,000 individuals over the last 3 months. And because of this amazing data, we actually knew which households, which doorstep did we need to deliver the rations. So really, again, using a lot of data to make sure that out-of-school girls are found. Again, it's very smart, all on the smartphone, real-time data, dynamic, geotagged to the household level, and then really be able to make sure the girls are connected to the school system. They have food, they're connected to the social protection schemes to make sure that they can stay in school and learn, and we can support them in whatever way and shape that is possible for us.
Great, that's really interesting to hear about this kind of predictive technologies you're using, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. If I can quickly follow up, Safeena, and ask, apart from the data which your team has been collecting, which is substantial, at a kind of wider country and government level, what kind of data is available around this?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the country level, what we're finding is that education is a state subject. So based on different states, you can have great variation in the data and the kind of quality of data. The second is that there can actually also be variations in the definitions, or what is a never enrolled, or what is a, and a lot of the times those children who haven't been in the school system, which are what we call the never enrolled girls, that number is just an approximate. So there's no accurate data for those girls, and they can sometimes, especially at adolescent levels, and in some areas they can be fairly high. And also because this is made worse because we have poor birth registration and other stuff in the villages and in tribal areas. So that, and the second thing is, I think the data that we do have, it's hard to make it actionable because, for example, our DICE data, it's available only a year later. So in terms of enrollment, and what we found is even our own door-to-door survey data, it kind of ages really fast because villages are not static, they're dynamic. Populations move in and out and all the rest of it. So unless you make data real-time, dynamic and actionable, it doesn't really feed into the planning, and it doesn't, so these are like some of the challenges, as differences across states, differences in definitions, and really no clear one source data for out of school girls. They are the most vulnerable. So that's what some of the challenges are, and the fact that data is available a year later.
And Hamzy, if I can ask you, what's the situation like in Nigeria in terms of the data that's available and some of the challenges in collecting accurate data, and then, as Safeena pointed out, in actually making those actionable?
Sadly, when it comes to data in Nigeria, it's more political. One, we have institutions that you have individuals that are more powerful than even institutions, and the institution that collects and publish this data usually come and say they lack resources to undertake this research. But then even with data from UNICEF, even data from Malala Fund or from World Bank or the Ministry of Education, most of this data are not aggregated data. And in most cases, you can't really work with those kind of data to really inform policy or campaign and get tangible results on the ground. And also when you look at policy and regulatory framework, so for instance, our National Assembly have passed the Child Rights Act in 2003, and a lot of the states, over 50% of the states in Nigeria have 36 states. They've not domesticated this act. And of course, we also have the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. And these are policy and regulations that are meant to, one, protect girls and women, but also help institutions to collect data, publish this data, and also inform government response and policy and decision making. But then I know, again, in the context of grassroots communities, and just to also buttress what Safeena has said, because if you look at India and Nigeria, they have so many similarities. Accessing this community, it's a big challenge. And you're talking about a country that is fragile. You're talking about a low-income country where you have over 90 million people who are very poor. So what this means is they can't even afford to send their children to school. And basic education, as much as they say it's free, it is not free. There are underlying fees that are captured in education, basic education spending in Nigeria. So for us, there's no access to disaggregated data and to inform policy and decision making. in real time. And there's also that argument between government and even the statistician general around data that is being published. Even government is refusing to accept that we have over 10 million out of school children. So how would you plan when you don't even accept the data that are available?
Thanks, Hamzy. And so, Laban, obviously the scale of this situation is unprecedented, but as we've seen, there's a lot of patterns emerging here that have also emerged from previous emergencies. What lessons, if any, can we take from some of the previous emergencies which have affected education and livelihoods, and how can we maybe apply them to the COVID recovery here to make sure that girls go back to school?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the COVID-19 has taught us great lessons that we need to really sit down, analyze, and go with it forward. One of such lessons is that coordination, collaboration, and partnership is key. In times like this, we need to come together to ensure that all our interventions, all our support is well coordinated. Another thing again is that there is a need for us to deal with misinformation and fake news and work closely together at the beginning. Now, scholars, education planners, scientists needs to come together at the beginning to ensure that you deal with the issue of misinformation. There's also a need for you to prepare for political tension. Political tension in the sense that I know currently the kind of pressure that is on Federal Ministry of Education to reopen schools. So you need some of those tensions are actually political. So you need to really prepare for that. Then there is a need for flexibility and adaptability. Yes. Don't just assume that because you have designed a program or a policy on this particular pattern, that is exactly how it's going to happen. No, you need to learn to adapt to the situation that is currently on ground now. Just like I was trying to share with us, I say for us in Plan International, what we quickly did, we tried to tap into the radio schooling that is currently going on in the northeastern part of the country. So what we did was to quickly establish learning cycles for these girls and children to come together and ensure that learning is actually taking place. Then there is a need for community-led approaches. Community-led approaches. Let's discuss with the members of the community on what is visible. Let's not sit down in the comfort of our offices and design programs in times like this. There is also a need for us to train, always train teachers, the school-based management committee, the PTA, on the issue of safety, on the issue of hygiene and the rest, so that we will not have, allow me to use the word, a fire brigade approach when pandemic and emergencies like this are happening. So for me, this, I think, the key issues or the key lessons I have learned.
Thank you, Laban. Safeena, you mentioned earlier the kind of predictive technologies that your team has been using. Where do you see opportunities maybe for those to be scaled out or scaled up, maybe adopted by other development actors or the government, and how they could maybe play a role in how we build back after this pandemic?
Yeah, I think, definitely, I think there's a lot of ways, and we're kind of thinking about it too, because we're still, I have to say, building out our predictive analytics works, but it is incredibly, incredibly helpful and sharp. But what we're thinking is right now we're using it to predict out of school girls. But how about we used it to predict which is the girl that is most at risk of dropping out, or which is the girl, so that I can actually tell my field workers saying tomorrow, knock on these doors. So if a girl is, a single parent, or an orphan girl, and that she's below poverty line and she's living with some guardian, her vulnerabilities are extreme. We want to be able to create at scale a predictive analytics that actually pushes grassroots workers to saying that's the door I need to knock on first. This is the child, and to be able to predict what is the risk of this girl dropping out, what is the risk of child marriage here. We know that after the 5th grade to the 6th grade, the transition, there's huge risks of dropping out if a child hasn't been in school for 2 weeks. So there's so much that we can do if we have good quality data. You can actually deliver just in time services to the most vulnerable girl at her doorstep. So that is one thing. But I did want to say, because you mentioned opportunities, and it's not just the data, and I think the data is a tool. But if you think about, let's look back in history. What is the greatest movement, a shift that happened for women and girls? It was the World Wars. It wasn't any NGO, and it wasn't any policy initiatives. It was the World Wars where, women had to become nurses and women had to start driving the trucks and all the rest of it. And once the women were out, you couldn't put them back in some sense of the word. So I think we can't let a good pandemic go to waste. We have to use this pandemic to really shift the needle on equity and for the need for girls' education. I think the big opportunity here is that governments are listening, that people are listening. And if we can adopt good, strong data technology, and there's an openness to technology as well, right? Everybody's kind of using remote training. And so with this openness, can we actually close the data gaps and actually build out some of these tools? And believe me, what we're talking about predictive analytics is nothing. They probably use more sophisticated technology to get you to pay your electricity bill on time. They're using much more sophisticated predictive stuff there, but how can we use that for our most vulnerable women and girls and our children?
Great, thank you, Safeena. Hamzy, I wonder where you see opportunities for different tech tools or partners to maybe be involved in the collection of data around gender issues or education in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you. First, if I can quickly talk about the opportunities and also leveraging on the experience from previous crises like Ebola, which ravaged even some African country. As much as we're dealing with COVID-19, they're still are recovering from Ebola crisis. And one of those, it's the fact that the country is hardest hit by Ebola. Students lost an approximately over 108,000 hours of education, ranging from 33 weeks in Guinea to 39 weeks in Sierra Leone, where schools reopened in 2015. We also saw that during the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, for instance, registered increased by 9% in schools age girls between 12 and 17 engaged in low-income activities. So once school reopened, children who found work. So again, children who found work, and right now, children who have found work during COVID-19 would not even want to go back to school. But what are the opportunities? Yes, technology plays a huge role. So for instance, in Nigeria, we have the conditional cash transfer scheme that helps poor families and households to cushion the effect of COVID-19, and government is currently sharing palliative. But what we've not seen is how government would tie this into education. So as an incentive, so for every parent who would send their kids to school or who would ensure that their children listen to learning via radio, would have access to unconditional cash transfer. Also is how can we ensure that we put the right legislative framework? So we're talking about both policy and regulatory framework. So policy-wise and legislative-wise, we have 9-year compulsory universal basic education in Nigeria. But what we're saying as Malala champion is, can we review this to 12 years compulsory education? And can we also ensure that we have strong regulations that deal with hidden fees? Because you can't say education is free and then you're still putting pressure on poor families to pay those hidden fees that are not documented. So for us, these are some of the opportunities while leveraging on technology. And today in Nigeria, every household have a mobile phone. But again, the opportunity is to collect data via SMS or voice, because for us at Connected Development, we have a toll-free number where citizens can call and give feedback. So it's just to scale on this kind of opportunity where government can provide a service delivery where citizens can give feedback and how it affects both girls and women. And I think also what plays a big role and how it deals with women and girls is culture, because you can talk about Nigeria and Africa, and culture, religion plays a big role. So for us also is working with traditional and religious leaders, traditional and religious leaders where they would start changing this norm and stop seeing women as a tool, or stop seeing women as a property where they could just acquire, or see women that their roles are just, in the house rather than in nation building and contributing to GDP. You've seen countries where women actually play significant role, how poverty level have been crashed and GDP has risen. So these are some of the opportunities we've highlighted.
Thanks, Hamzy. And Laban, if I can ask you one final question before we move on to the data presentation, which will touch on this a little bit, but you mentioned the digital divide. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about some of the challenges which you and also Safeena mentioned that you've encountered around the digital divide in the last month.
Okay. Of course, the issue of internet is actually a challenge in this part of the world, most especially when you go to the northeast part of the country. So you have a child that currently what is happening in the country is the issue of the online schooling. Now, this child in the community doesn't have access to the internet, some don't even have access to radio. So with that, this situation has really created another inequality. Yeah, so what we need to really look at is not emphasizing on just one approach, but can we try to look around and see what is based on the context of the environment that we are working, what fits into that particular environment. So if we keep emphasizing on the issue of online classrooms, online models going on, then definitely you have some children that will definitely be left out. Now, also, there is this issue of emphasizing on the need for girls to participate. Now, you will agree with me also that you have more boys having access to some of those digital instruments that they can use to access the home learning as compared to girls. So these are things that we have observed. And then lastly, the issue of the quality of learning that is happening online. Nobody seems to be monitoring it. Nobody seems to be asking questions about the learning achievements of these children. So it's just a matter of broadcasting lessons. In fact, in one state, we have observed that what they really do is just broadcasting lessons that are the same, not minding the levels of the classrooms. So these are issues. These are issues for us to learn. These are issues for us to go back to the policymakers and really find a way out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that Sunita is going to touch on some of these issues in a moment, but very quickly, Safeena, I wanted to give you a chance to comment maybe on some of the challenges around the digital divide that you've encountered.
My God, I think in terms of the digital divide, I just want to tell you one story from, and this is a story from Ajmer, and girl was preparing for her secondary, for her 10th school exams. And because of the lockdown, so she was on her phone trying to get information, talking to a friend, and the father and the brother were at home in the lockdown. The brother sees her on the phone, slaps her, tells her that she's bringing dishonor on the family because she must be talking to a boy and a boyfriend. The girl gets so upset. She was so angry. She got so upset. She drank poison to try and commit suicide. She was saved, but the parents got her married off and shipped her off to her husband's home just because there could be dishonor coming onto the family. And I'm telling you this story because within weeks of this happening, 3 other girls from the same village met the same fate. They were married off and they were shipped off. So parents have this incredible fear that phones will make the girls lose characters, that they will run away, that they will elope, that they will have boyfriends, and they will bring dishonor. And so in that kind of a situation, to expect learning to happen, even after like she wakes up at 5 a.m. and is the last one to go to sleep and the last one to eat and all the rest of it, for her to get access to a phone. And also in the kind of areas we work in, we're not seeing more than 15% smartphone penetration regardless in our households. So the digital divide is A, I mean, for rural, remote, tribal girls, there is no smartphone in the house. And B, even if there is, it's not going to come to them. So it's a huge piece. If we're just thinking about online learning, we can almost think that, they are going to not, let's just assume that they're not going to have access to it. So unless we solve for them, we're not solving for anything.
Thank you, Safeena. I think an example there that really highlights the range of issues when we're talking about this digital divide. But now I'd love to pass it over to Sunita, who is going to tell us a little bit more about what her team have been working on to advance access to education globally. So Sunita, over to you.
Great, thank you, Emma. Thanks so much. Just going to go ahead and share my screen very briefly. All right, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you're all keeping well during what is still, for a lot of us, a challenging time personally as well. And today, thanks so much for inviting me to speak here today. I come from a team based within UNICEF's headquarters in New York called UNICEF Ventures. We explore in particular the use of emerging technologies and how we can support the work that UNICEF does. So today, I want to speak to you briefly, and this is really just to give a taster of some of the work that we've done, and really appreciated some of the comments that were being made around the impact of the digital divide, but also the potential that data has to help us target our solutions better and respond to them. So today, I'm going to speak about data basically as having three different opportunities. One of them is to better assess need and demand. And in this case, I'll speak specifically about connectivity and deploying connectivity, also how data can improve accountability for service delivery and how we're looking to do that. And then lastly, how data and solutions that leverage data actually as public goods can support scaling of the response to COVID-19, but of course also more generally, and I'll give some examples around education and specifically what we're doing in the COVID response as UNICEF. So UNICEF, together with the International Telecommunications Union, recently launched the initiative called GIGA, which aims to connect every young person in the world to information, opportunity, and choice. And we aim to do that through increased access through connectivity, affordable connectivity. And that's really based on the observation, of course, that most of you are familiar with, and we've just heard about what's really some of the practical implications are around lack of access to connectivity, and that half of humanity still doesn't have internet access. And with that lack of internet access, that does not only have implications on the opportunities that young people have today, but it also has implications on what their opportunities might be in future in terms of the skills they're able to access, but also the kinds of opportunities and where industries are moving to in the next 5 to 10 years. I won't go into this data again in detail. We've heard, I think, very vividly about the implications at country level, but the scale of this situation is quite incredible. 191 countries closed their schools. And during this time, what we've seen, as Laban also spoke to, we've seen a shift to remote learning, to disseminating of content across different channels. And where connectivity exists, we obviously have particular opportunities. And then we have to look for other solutions in those areas where currently no internet connectivity is there. The problem is that internet connectivity then becomes a factor that can actually further exacerbate inequalities rather than actually addressing it, if we are targeting and only working in those areas where internet connectivity is already being provided. And so through GIGA, we're aiming to identify the areas in countries that actually require either improved connectivity or connectivity at all in the first place. We're providing a service offering that hopefully will enable countries to more quickly and more efficiently and effectively scale connectivity, and finally deliver the public services and digital services on top of that connectivity, which is where really the building of opportunity comes into play. So very briefly, coming back to this idea of data being a tool to measure demand and need, we've developed a platform that shows where schools are located and what their connectivity status is. So here you see a map of all the schools in Colombia, actually through this exercise, which leveraged satellite data and machine learning. We were actually able to map 7,000 schools that the government wasn't even aware of existed. So they weren't included on public information registries. So you see here, the green dots are those connected with 3 Mbps, and of course down to red ones that have no access to connectivity. Similarly here, Sierra Leone, you'll see quite a different image, of course, where you largely see connectivity concentrated in the urban areas. Kyrgyzstan, another country that we've done this mapping in, very interestingly, has already been able to convert this data to actually connect schools that were previously unconnected, but also then be able to monitor that service delivery. So the government was under the impression that a service provider was actually providing internet to certain schools, but with the real-time data coming in and being provided to the government through this dashboard, they were able to actually hold service providers to account the services they were meant to be delivering. So overall, we currently have 800,000 schools mapped in 25 countries. The aim is to achieve global coverage. And here we really rely very heavily on data partnerships that give us some of the big data that allow us to do the analysis, but of course also primary data collected through ministries of education and other public partners, where we're able to map the data and connectivity status. Now, what does that data allow us to do? It allows us to assess which schools are already connected and which ones still need to be connected to the internet. And we're hearing these requests from country governments. So Kenya, for example, where we've started the work of GIGA, government is not only looking for location data, but basically is saying, could we help them attract further private sector investments and connectivity by reducing risk? So often connectivity deployments are quite high, capital intensive deployments. Could we find the funds to connect a small number of schools immediately to at least a minimum level of connectivity that would allow for the deployment of certain services, for instance, remote learning or health services during this pandemic? And further, could we help them make the case that actually some of the investment that's being provided by development banks and others, for instance, is needed to train teachers to then actually be able to deploy and, as we heard about, actually measure the impact of digital solutions that are being used to support learning outcomes during the pandemic. So in summary, basically, we're looking to resolve information gaps at the country level through leveraging big data and new technologies, improve conditions for financing, then launch a national common bid that's really data-driven and uses new tools that allows us to track the disbursement of money and service delivery, whereby then finally also creating sustainable structures. And I'll speak a little bit more about that towards the end. Now, what's new that's allowed us to do this now is, as I've mentioned before, really some of the new connectivity technology that's available that allows us to provide connectivity to regions that otherwise would have been very difficult to access, but also new technologies that can improve accountability. And this is the second point that I wanted to speak to a little bit about how we're basically looking to use blockchain, for instance, and dashboards like the one that I'm showing here to allow governments to actually track whether services are being provided. And because that information is decentralized, we're able to make sure that it's immutable and can actually be tracked in real time to ensure that services remain accountable to the communities that are actually receiving them. Jumping ahead to the delivery of solutions on top of that connectivity, I wanted to speak to you briefly today about our venture fund and specifically give some examples about the solutions that we've developed that leverage big data and also that turn solutions into public goods. So our venture fund is a $30 million fund that is the first of its kind really within the UN system. We make investments to startups that are registered exclusively in developing and emerging markets and that focus on frontier technologies. We disperse US dollars as a traditional fund would, but also cryptocurrency. And that's a new form of disbursement that we were able to put in place last year. Again, coming back to this point of data as an accountability measure, cryptocurrency allows anyone to track where the funding flows and who it's been given by and who it's been received by. It significantly cut our transaction costs. So I won't go into detail on that here because it's not the focus of the presentation, but I did want to flag it as new ways of dispersing funding that we at least see as significantly improving the efficiency of our programs. So our venture fund focuses on frontier technology areas, and you see some of these listed on the slide here. Really see the need to develop new solutions, and we heard Safeena, for instance, speak about how her team has leveraged machine learning to do predictive analysis, and it's exactly that kind of solution that we think would have incredible potential, but often is seen as quite high risk and is quite cutting edge. And so from a development perspective, we find that a lot of the groups, private companies and others that are developing these solutions may struggle to actually get the seed funding to develop this further. And so the purpose of our fund is really to invest in small groups, startups, or UNICEF teams and help them scale and test these new solutions to ultimately become digital public goods. Some of you may be familiar with the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, which he launched 2 or 3 weeks ago, and where he acknowledged the importance of digital public goods for the acceleration of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've seen, particularly during a time of emergency and pandemic, that when solutions and data are open and can be leveraged very quickly by partners and different stakeholders, that can significantly accelerate how quickly we can deploy these solutions and see an impact on the ground. And so our fund has made approximately 100 investments in digital public goods across different regions here. And we're actually very proud to announce today a new cohort that's focused exclusively on how to leverage frontier technologies for learning. And so I wanted to very briefly just mention some of these examples here. We see, for instance, that we have a company from Kenya developing a digital learning platform for adaptive assessment and tailored support. We've heard, I think, often the need for digital learning platforms to be more adaptive, to be able to respond to the specific needs of children, rather than just being a standard method for deploying content. And so we're very proud to see that we've been able to identify some promising solutions in that area, where of course now the next year will be all about further developing that product and generating the data to show that they actually have an impact. Remote learning and work, very timely need at the moment. This is actually a call that we launched pre-COVID, and it's turned out that some of these solutions that we identify will obviously be very much needed over the next year or two. And so particularly also looking at how XR, so that's virtual and augmented reality, can actually bring some of the learning experiences further to life. Job matching, which basically leverages artificial intelligence to match candidates with employers. So how can we make sure also that the changing needs of employers and industries feed back into the skills that young people and children get during their learning experiences at a young age and prepare them for the economies and job market of the future. And finally, a mapping tool which will complement and work very well together with our mapping tool that identifies the need for connectivity. Finally, just to wrap up, I wanted to quickly flag, and I won't go into detail here, but some of the exciting work that UNICEF is doing with support of partners around leveraging big data to understand better the implications of some of the measures that governments are taking during the COVID-19 response. So we're trying to analyze what, for instance, the impact of social distancing policies have been on movement and how they affect different socioeconomic groups within a country differently, what the implications might be on their status in the long term. We're also seeing emerge some initial data around how these measures affect men and women differently. And so I'm just flashing up this slide very briefly. You can find all of these reports online, and we'll share the link in the chat after this. But really, maybe not surprisingly, we're seeing that women have greater reduction in movements with social distancing policies, often because, as we've heard, they are the ones who stay at home to take care of children, facilitate maybe some of the remote learning, and are even further restricted and bound to household duties. So really wanted to just flag the work that we're doing here in terms of developing digital public goods. So goods that can facilitate and be facilitated to scale more easily because they're in the public domain. And really what we're aiming to do through the Digital Public Goods Alliance, which is an international partnership, is not only identify and source those, but actually support them to go all the way to scale through sustainable business models. So Emma, thank you so much for the opportunity to present some of this work, and I look forward to the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much in there, and some really fascinating maps showing the kind of differences in data collection and knowledge in different places, and also some really nice kind of solutions for adaptive learning there coming from different countries. I'm sure we're going to have a few follow-up questions on that, so thank you very much for that, Sunita. Yeah, we'll jump over to the Q&A now, because we do have quite a lot of questions have already come in from our audience. So I want to try and get to as many of those as we can. Just to kick things off, there's one here for Laban. If you could tell us a little bit more about the recommendations that you mentioned you were kind of helping draft up the guidelines for schools reopening, and especially the guidelines for schools reopening in a way that is safe for girls to return.
Okay. For the school reopening, what we did as an organization, that's Plan International, is to link up with the wider Education in Emergency Working Group, just like I've said. It has series of activities that needs to be done before schools resume. A series of activities that needs to be done also, consulting with government stakeholders. For example, of course, the situation that we're in the country in terms of infrastructure. You go to a school where you have a class of 150. So the issue of social distancing will not arise there. So what we advise is, okay, can we do shifts? Can we also do blended approach? So what we mean by blended approach is that, can we have the children come to school maybe on Monday, get their lessons note, get workbooks of what they need to do throughout the week, then go back home? Can we also ensure that for each class we have a hand washing basin so that these children can wash their hands? Now, a whole lot of suggestions in the guideline, which I'm ready to share with you so that you can forward it for us to see. Now, also, there is this issue of building back better. Of course, none of us was ready for COVID-19, but for sure, the issue of reopening of schools, we need to start getting ready for it. So building back better is trying to emphasize working with government, relevant government officials, government agencies to see what do we need to put in place for a school. Basic things, basic like water, basic like gender segregated latrines. These are basic things. So you wonder how government will approve a school in a community where you don't have these basic facilities. So this are actually some of, in summary, the content of the guideline for us in the country. So what we are going to be doing in the coming months is to conduct like a perception survey. Perception survey for parents, perception survey for education planners, perception survey for the children themselves, just to assess their level of perception in terms of the reopening of schools. This is all contained in the guideline. Now, once we do that, then we will further engage with the Ministry of Education to make decisions based on data, not based on speculations, not based on thinking, but based on data that is available to us. So these are some of those issues that are clearly spelled out in the guidelines, which I will share.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I'm sure our audience would love to have a look at those guidelines and have a copy of those. Sorry, a question now for Sunita. It's around the role that social media could potentially play, and also what other data could tech companies already be sitting on that could help out NGOs or grassroots organizations?
Sure. So some of the work that I presented today builds on the experience of doing similar predictive analysis for other epidemic outbreaks. So obviously COVID-19 has a very particular feature and epidemiological profile, but we've seen other outbreaks in the last couple of years, including Ebola, for instance, or also Zika in Latin America. And so depending on what on which crisis you're dealing with, different sources of data become more or less relevant. Two sources of data that we've seen consistently being relevant is travel data, for instance. So we have a partnership with Amadeus, which is the travel booking company that basically powers any website that you may use to book a flight. And so they've provided us with their flight data so we can look at international, in particular, transmission between major areas within a country. Mobile network operator data is another very interesting source, and we heard already from the other speakers how universal access to mobile phones really is. And so we're seeing there that again allows us to look at mobility patterns. And this is anonymized, aggregated data. We're not looking at individual level data here at all, but we can see in aggregate how many people might be moving over a certain period of time and over what distance between different locations. And that's helped us, again, look at patterns of infection. We've used that particularly during the Ebola response, for instance. And again, are using that now during COVID-19 as well. Social media, of course, also generates a data footprint. And so in some cases, depending on the platform, we're talking about you can derive different insights from that. We've seen some of our team has done some work, for instance, on Twitter behavior. This is a couple of years ago already, that allowed to predict unemployment rates to the same level of accuracy as, for instance, census data has. Or look at Twitter data, for instance, to come up with an equivalent of the Human Development Index, but far more quickly and with lower resources. And so it really depends on the type of insight you're trying to gain to see what data source might be the most relevant to use for these kinds of analyses.
Great, thank you, Sunita. Safeena, if I can ask you now, and we're a little bit short of time, so just to allow us to get a few more questions, if you could keep your answers fairly brief, but we have a question for you around the kind of ethics and privacy issues that you have to consider when you're collecting data from girls to ensure that they're safe. Could you comment quickly on some of the things that you have to consider there?
Yeah, absolutely. You really have to, and therefore we have a very strong technical advisory group that actually makes sure that the data is anonymized, that you're not compromising anybody's privacy. An example, somebody asked us to make predictive analytics work public, like on a website. And we realized that if we did that, you would actually be giving a guiding signal to traffickers, So there's so many perverse incentives that you can actually kick off, even though you want to do good and you want to do, public good, but you have to be so careful. And you have to make sure that, you guard that data and you're very careful with it. And you have to have enough good gatekeepers to actually tell you how to create that kind of privacy and security.
Great, thank you. And Hamzy, a question for you around a lot of countries are reporting surges in teen pregnancies during the pandemic. What plans would you like to see the government putting in place, or could they be putting in place to ensure that girls return to school and can do so in a way that's healthy and safe for them?
For us is obviously providing safe space, government investing in and providing safe space for girls to go back to school. Also, girls are protected from negative coping mechanism that can harm them and their ability to continue their education. We're engaging the Ministry of Education to develop and implement a gender-responsive resumption plan so girls can actually return to school post-COVID-19, and the Ministry of Finance to maintain education share of the national budget. And that's why our organization is also following education spending, both by international aid organizations and governments, spending just to ensure budget release and utilization and to reduce corruption and ensure better service delivery as it affects girls.
Thanks, Hamzy. And thank you everyone for keeping your answers brief. I'm sure you could go into more detail. We are just on the hour, so I just wanted to finish with a quick kind of wrap-up question. Maybe you could all try and summarize in 30 seconds or so, what can we do to build back better from this pandemic, particularly thinking about, if there's a second wave or another emergency that it causes lockdowns and school closures. Safeena, maybe I can start with you on your kind of thoughts on what we can do to build back better. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think to really build back better, we have to reimagine. We have to keep the most vulnerable girls at the center of our planning. And we have to bring real intentionality to and a gender lens to all of our policies to make sure that they're inclusive. And definitely, as Laban had kind of mentioned, we need a convergence approach. That's what the pandemic is really teaching us. You need convergence, and let's reimagine a whole different future.
Thank you. Sunita, can I jump next to you for your 30 seconds or so?
No, I think we are, faced with an incredible challenge that none of us predicted. And I think just building on what we heard about building back better is, I think, what we need to be looking at, and how we put in place the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure that allows us not only to respond to what's happening now, but hopefully actually build up the systems that will see greater equity, in the longer term when it comes to education and skills development and opportunities moving forward. That's kind of, I think, where we see the focus.
Laban, what's building back better to you?
Okay. I want us to agree and implement a global post-COVID-19 action plan. I know that the Global Partnership for Education is working on a similar plan. It would be good for us to coordinate properly and invest and agree to invest in that. There's also a need for government to invest in education. So we're talking about the issue of education financing now. The share of the education budget needs to be quickly taken up based on the recommendation of UNESCO. And lastly, there is a need for us to monitor progress and also hold duty bearers to account.
Thank you. And finally, Hamzy, over to you.
Well, for me, we can talk about girls and women and not allow them speak for themselves. So let's have more girls actually shape this policy. Let's listen to them and actually do what they want us to do. So, let's rebuild back by not having, more of these government people sit down in comfortable offices and then draw policies. Let's go and meet these girls wherever they are. Leave our comfort zone, because they're being discomfort right now. So we need to leave our comfort zone, meet them, talk to them, and have them speak for themselves. And lastly, let's all follow the money, because in the money, we'll find answers.
Great, thank you to all for those kind of final parting words. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today, but thanks again to Safeena, Hamzat, Laban, and Sunita. It was really great having you for this really interesting conversation and for sharing your expertise. And also, once again, thanks to everyone who joined and for all your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get time to get to all of them. We will be sharing a recording of the event and a copy of the slides by email with you all shortly, so do look out for that. And do make sure to sign up for our final event, which will take place on Wednesday next week. And we'll be looking at the use of data to ensure the well-being of women and girls as we build back from the pandemic. And although that will be the last event in this series, a content series on gender data is in the works, so stay tuned for more on that. Until then, all the best from the team here at Devex.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.